The funeral was a quiet affair, which suited my grandfather just fine. He had been a quiet man, not the shy kind of quiet, but the heavy, deliberate silence of a mountain that has stood in place for 10,000 years, and sees no reason to explain itself to the wind. There were only 4 of us standing around the open grave, me, the priest, a gravedigger leaning on his shovel near the tree line, and Mr. Henderson, my grandfather's attorney. The wind whipped across the cemetery, carrying the biting scent of turning leaves and impending snow. It was late October in Wyoming, and the sky was already threatening to close up shop for the winter. I watched the mahogany casket lowered into the dark earth, and felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. It wasn't grief, exactly. I hadn't known the man well enough for grief. It was more like the feeling you get when a massive old tree finally topples in the forest, a sense that the landscape has fundamentally changed, leaving a gap where something formidable used to be. "Elias," Mr. Henderson said, his voice rasping like dry paper. He stepped up beside me as the priest closed his Bible. Henderson was a man who looked like he had been dried out and preserved, much like the legal documents he carried in his battered leather briefcase. "We need to discuss the estate. Can it wait until we're out of the wind?" I asked, pulling my coat collar tighter against my neck. "It cannot," Henderson said. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the dirt being shoveled onto the casket. "Your grandfather left specific instructions. The deed and the keys were to be handed over immediately upon his interment. Not an hour before, not an hour later." He clicked the latches of his briefcase. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in the quiet cemetery. He pulled out a thick manila envelope, sealed with red wax, and a heavy iron key ring. The keys were old, not the shiny brass Kwikset keys you get for a suburban condo, but long skeleton-style iron keys, and a few jagged, industrial-looking ones that belonged to heavy padlocks. "The cabin is yours," Henderson said, thrusting the items into my hands. "It's fully paid off. The land taxes are covered for the next 50 years by a trust. It sits on 40 acres bordering the Bighorn National Forest. It is isolated." "I know," I said, weighing the keys in my palm. They felt unnaturally cold, sucking the heat right out of my skin. "I went there once when I was a kid. I remember the trees." Henderson turned to me then, and for the first time, I saw something behind his wire-rimmed glasses that unsettled me. It wasn't sadness. It was relief. He looked like a man who had just passed a live grenade to someone else. "Listen to me closely, son," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that the wind nearly stole. "There's a letter inside that envelope. Do not open it until you are inside the cabin. Not in your car. Not at a diner on the way up. Inside the cabin. Do you understand?" "Why?" I asked, a nervous laugh bubbling up. "Is it a treasure map?" Henderson didn't smile. He reached out and gripped my shoulder with a strength that surprised me. "Just follow the instructions, Elias. Your grandfather was a hard man, but he wasn't a liar. He kept that place for a reason. Now it's your turn." He let go, buttoned his coat, and walked away toward his car without looking back, leaving me standing alone with a pocket full of cold iron and a dead man's secrets. The first flakes of snow began to drift down, settling on the fresh dirt of the grave. I looked at the envelope. In my grandfather's jagged, forceful handwriting, it simply read, "For the owner." I didn't know it then, but I wasn't just inheriting a piece of property. I was inheriting a prison, and I had just volunteered to be the warden. The drive from the cemetery to the trailhead took 3 hours, but it felt like driving backward through time. The 4-lane highway dissolved into a 2-lane blacktop, which eventually crumbled into a rutted gravel, logging road that wound its way up into the throat of the Bighorn Mountains. Civilization peeled away in layers. First, the strip malls and gas stations vanished, replaced by sprawling ranch land and endless barbed wire fences. Then, the ranches grew sparse, the gaps between houses stretching from miles to tens of miles. Finally, even the power lines stopped following the road, cutting off into the trees like they had given up trying to tame the landscape. My truck, a sturdy Ford ID bought specifically for this trip, bounced and groaned over the washboard gravel. The radio signal had died an hour ago, fading into a static hiss that sounded suspiciously like whispering if you listened to it for too long. I turned it off. The silence that filled the cab was absolute, broken only by the crunch of tires on stone, and the low whine of the engine fighting the incline. The higher I climbed, the more the world turned gray. The sky was a flat sheet of slate, pressing down on the peaks. The pines here were ancient, their branches heavy with the accumulated snow of early winter squalls. They crowded the road, leaning in as if to inspect anyone foolish enough to pass. I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank, just a blue arrow floating in a sea of gray pixels. No signal flashed in the corner. My grandfather's directions were scrawled on a napkin I had pinned to the dashboard. Turn left at the lightning-struck pine. Follow the creek bed for 2 miles. If you see the rusted tractor, you've gone too far. I spotted the pine charred, blackened skeleton of a tree standing vigil at a fork in the road, and hauled the wheel to the left. The truck lurched onto what could barely be called a road. It was more of a scar in the earth, overgrown with scrub brush and littered with stones the size of bowling balls. As I navigated the trail, a sense of deep isolation settled into my bones. It wasn't just that I was alone. It was the aggressive nature of the solitude. The landscape here felt indifferent to human life, bordering on hostile. The temperature gauge on my dashboard dropped steadily, 30 degrees, 28, 24. And then, I saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing backed against a sheer granite cliff face. It was larger than I remembered, built from massive dark timber logs that looked like they had been hewn by giants. A stone chimney rose from the slate roof, cold and smokeless. The windows were dark, staring out at the clearing like empty eye sockets. There was no welcoming porch swing, no flower beds. The structure looked like a fortress, hunkered down against the mountain, built to withstand sieges rather than host vacations. I parked the truck. The engine ticked as it cooled. I stepped out, and the silence hit me like a physical blow. There were no birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just the wind moaning through the high peaks, and the smell of pine resin and coming snow. I walked up the steps, the wood groaning under my boots. The front door was a slab of solid oak, reinforced with iron bands. I fished the heavy iron key ring from my pocket, my fingers clumsy with cold. The largest key slid into the lock with a heavy mechanical thunk. I turned it. The mechanism resisted for a moment, then yielded with a grind of metal on metal. I pushed the door open and stepped across the threshold. The air inside was stale, preserved, smelling of old tobacco smoke, wood ash, and something faint and metallic, like old copper pennies. I was in. The world outside the highways, the cell phones. The attorneys felt a million miles away. I was in my grandfather's world now, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't empty, it was waiting. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor, kicking up a small cloud of dust that danced in the pale light filtering through the dirty windows. The interior was exactly as I had pictured it in my nightmares, utilitarian, masculine, and sparse. A large stone fireplace dominated the north wall. A heavy wooden table with 2 chairs sat in the center. Along the walls were shelves lined with dusty jars, old hunting gear, and rows of books with spines faded by time. But my attention was drawn immediately to the kitchen counter. Sitting there, centered perfectly on the butcher block island, was a solitary wooden box. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a cigar humidor, but it commanded the room. I walked over, my footsteps echoing too loudly on the hardwood floor. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the sealed envelope Mr. Henderson had given me. "Open inside the cabin," he had said. I tore the wax seal. The paper was thick, expensive stock. Inside were 2 documents. The first was the official deed to the property, stamped and notarized. I set it aside. The second was a single sheet of yellowed lined paper, torn from a legal pad. The handwriting was unmistakable, my grandfather's sharp, angular scrawl. The ink pressed so hard into the paper that I could feel the ridges on the back. To Elias, it began. "No dear, no love, Grandpa. Just the name. If you are reading this, I am dead, and you have been foolish enough to accept the inheritance. I tried to sell this land 20 years ago, but the buyers kept leaving or changing their minds, or disappearing. So it falls to blood. It falls to you. This cabin is a shelter, but it is also a capstone. It sits on top of something that must not be let out. You don't need to understand what it is, honestly. I don't think you could if you tried, but you do need to understand how to survive it. There are rules. These are not suggestions. These are the laws of physics in this house. Break them, and you die. Or worse, I snorted, shaking my head. The old man had always been dramatic, filled with tall tales about bears the size of trucks and spirits in the woods. This was probably his final prank, a way to keep me on my toes. I looked down at the list. 1. Keep the fire burning from dusk until dawn. Do not let it go out. 2. If you hear knocking at the front door after sunset, do not answer it. There is no one within 30 miles of you. 3. Do not look into the mirrors after midnight. Cover them if you must. 4. If the generator fails, fix it immediately. The lights are your shield. And then, at the bottom, circled 3 times in red ink, was the final rule. 5. Never go to the basement alone. I stared at the last line. Never go to the basement alone. Well, that's a problem, I muttered to the empty room, my voice sounding thin and weak. Considering him the only one here, it had to be a joke, a safety precaution about steep stairs or faulty wiring, dressed up in ghost story rhetoric. Grandfather knew I'd be up here solo. He knew I was a loner, just like him. Why give me a rule I couldn't follow without breaking the laws of logic? Unless the point was simply, don't go to the basement at all. I looked around the room, in the corner, near the hallway that led to the single bedroom, was a door. It was painted a stark, heavy black, contrasting with the warm wood tones of the rest of the cabin. A heavy iron deadbolt, brand new, by the looks of it, was installed near the top, and below that, a padlock hasp. Currently empty, I walked over to it. I didn't touch the handle, I just stood there, listening silence. Just the settling of the house. Crazy old coot, I whispered, trying to inject some bravado into the air. I turned back to the kitchen to unpack my supplies, tossing the list onto the table. But as I walked away, the floorboards beneath my feet vibrated. It was subtle, a faint tremor, like a heavy truck passing on a distant highway. But there were no highways. There were no trucks. I stopped. The vibration came again. Thump, pause, thump. It was rhythmic, slow, deliberate. And it wasn't coming from the walls or the roof. It was coming from below, from beneath the black door, from the basement. I looked back at the list on the table. The red ink of rule number 5 seemed to glow in the dim light. Never go to the basement alone. I wasn't laughing anymore. The sun didn't set so much as it was swallowed. 1 minute the light was a dull, bruised purple filtering through the trees. The next, the world outside was a wall of absolute black. I had never experienced darkness like this. In the city, night is just a different shade of gray, diluted by street lamps and light pollution. Here, the darkness was a physical weight. It pressed against the windows like oil. I busied myself with the mundane tasks of survival, trying to ignore the creeping sensation on the back of my neck. I unpacked my groceries: canned chili, coffee, whiskey, dried beef. I primed the generator in the shed out back, wincing at the roar it made when it kicked to life, shattering the silence of the mountain. It felt like ringing a dinner bell for every predator in a 10-mile radius. Inside, I followed rule number 1 instinctively. I built a fire in the massive stone hearth, stacking dry logs until the flames roared and popped, casting dancing shadows across the room. The heat was comforting, pushing back the chill that seeped from the walls. But the light was tricky. It made the shadows in the corners stretch and contract, looking like long, thin fingers reaching for the center of the room. I sat in the leather armchair facing the fire, a glass of whiskey in my hand, listening. The wind had picked up. It howled around the eaves of the cabin, sounding eerily like a human voice moaning in pain. Hoo, he yelped. It was just the wind, I told myself. Pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns where there are none. But beneath the wind, beneath the crackle of the fire, the thumping continued. Thump, thump. It was louder now than it had been in the afternoon. It sounded like something heavy and soft hitting the underside of the floorboards, like a fist wrapped in a thick blanket pounding against the ceiling of the basement. I tried to read a book, but my eyes kept darting to the black door in the corner. The deadbolt gleamed in the firelight. It looked solid, secure. But the scratching sound that started around 9 p.m. tested my faith in metallurgy. Scritch, scritch. It wasn't a mouse. Mice scurry. This was slow, deliberate. It sounded like a long fingernail testing the wood, searching for a gap, a seam, a weakness. I stood up, the whiskey sloshing in my glass. Hello, I called out. My voice cracked. Is there an animal down there? The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with intent. It felt like the house was holding its breath. Then, from directly beneath my feet so close, I felt the vibration through the soles of my boots, came a sound that made my blood turn to ice water. It was a sigh, a long, weary, distinctly human sigh. It wasn't a groan of pipes settling. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a man who had been waiting a very, very long time. I backed away toward the fireplace, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the stand. I stood there for an hour, hard hammering against my ribs, waiting for the door to burst open. But nothing happened. The scratching didn't resume. The thumping stopped. Eventually, exhaustion overtook adrenaline. I dragged the armchair closer to the fire, wrapped myself in a wool blanket, and stared at the flames until my eyes burned. I didn't go to the bedroom. It was too far from the fire, too close to the black door. I fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming of dark tunnels and faces pressed against wet glass. And in my dream, I wasn't alone in the basement. I was standing in the dark, and a hand cold, wet, and impossibly strong was closing around my ankle. I woke up with a start. The fire died down to embers. The room was cold, and the basement door handle. It was turned, just slightly, angled down, as if someone on the other side had tried it, found it locked, and gently released it. I scrambled up, threw 3 more logs on the fire, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Morning arrived like a reluctant guest, pale gray and cold. The sunlight, diffused through the heavy cloud cover, didn't do much to warm the cabin. But it did strip away the phantom terrors of the night. In the daylight, the shadows retreated to the corners, and the wind sounded like wind again, not moaning voices. I made strong coffee, drinking it black as I stood in the center of the room, staring at the black door. It looked innocuous now, just a door, wood, paint, iron. The handle was horizontal again, the latch engaged. Had I imagined it turning in the night? Sleep deprivation and stress can do strange things to the mind. I told myself it was just gravity, or maybe the vibration of the generator causing the mechanism to sag. I set my mug down and walked over to it. I needed to see. If I was going to stay here, if I was going to follow my grandfather's wishes, I couldn't be terrified of a closet. I reached out and touched the wood. It was freezing cold, not just room temperature cold, but ice cold, as if there were a deep freezer running on the other side. I examined the locks. There were 3 of them, the standard doorknob lock, the heavy deadbolt I had noticed yesterday, and a third one I hadn't seen in the dim light, a thick, sliding iron bolt at the very bottom, near the floor. I crouched down to inspect the bottom bolt. That's when I saw the scratches. They weren't on the frame. They were on the door itself, near the bottom gap. Deep, frantic gouges in the wood, stripping away the black paint to reveal the pale pine underneath. They looked like something had been trying to claw its way out from underneath the door, or pull the door open from the bottom. But the most disturbing part wasn't the scratches themselves. It was the direction. The wood splinters were bent outward. Whatever had made these marks had been on the inside, on the stairwell side, digging its claws into the wood and pulling. I stood up, my knees cracking. I looked at the deadbolt. It was a heavy-duty model, the kind you see on bank vaults or panic rooms. And then realization hit me, a detail so obvious I felt stupid for missing it. The deadbolt was installed backward. Usually, the keyhole is on the outside, and the thumb-turn latch is on the inside, so you can lock the door from the inside for privacy or safety. Here the keyhole was facing me. The thumb-turn would be on the other side, in the basement, except there was no keyhole. It was a single-sided deadbolt. It could only be locked or unlocked from this side, the cabin side. It wasn't a lock designed to keep people out of the basement. It was designed to keep something in. "Jesus, Grandpa," I whispered. "What did you have down there? A rabid bear?" I stepped back, sudden claustrophobia gripping me. "The rules. Rule number 5. Never go to the basement alone. It implied that going down with someone else was safe, or safer. Why? Safety in numbers. Or was it something else? Did whatever lived down there need to be distracted? I grabbed the heavy iron key ring Mr. Henderson had given me. There was one large jagged key that looked like it belonged to a medieval dungeon. I held it up to the deadbolt. It looked like a match. For a second, just a split second, I considered opening it, just cracking it an inch, shining a flashlight down there to prove to myself it was just an empty, cold root cellar. "Don't do it," a voice in my head screamed. "Follow the rules." I lowered the key. I wasn't going to open it. Not yet. Not until I knew more. I turned away from the door, intending to go outside and check the generator fuel. As I walked away, I heard it. It was faint, but unmistakable. Click, the sound of a lock tumbling. I spun around. The door hadn't moved. The deadbolt was still thrown, but the sound had come from the other side. Something was trying to pick the lock from the inside. I was standing there staring at the door like it was a loaded gun, when a heavy pounding on the front door made me jump nearly a foot in the air. Bang, bang. My hand went instinctively to the hunting knife on my belt. I checked my watch. 10:30 a.m. Rule number 2 said, if you hear knocking at the front door after sunset, do not answer it. It was well before sunset. The rule didn't apply. Still, my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I approached the heavy oak slab. I peered through the peephole. Distorted by the fisheye lens, I saw a uniform. Tan shirt, dark green pants, a wide-brimmed hat. A ranger. I let out a breath. I didn't know I was holding and unlocked the door. Standing on the porch was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the same granite as the mountain. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by wind and sun. His name tag read Miller. "Morning," he said. His voice was deep, gravelly. He didn't smile. He was looking past me into the cabin, his eyes darting around the interior before settling back on my face. "Morning," I managed. "Can I help you?" "Just doing a perimeter check," Miller said. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his boots crunching on the frost-covered porch. "Saw the smoke from the chimney. Didn't know anyone was up here. Old man Silas passed, didn't he?" "Yeah, him his grandson Elias." "Elias," Miller nodded. He didn't offer his hand. "Well, Elias, you picked a hell of a time to visit. Teresa's storm front moving in. Big one. They're calling for 3, maybe 4 feet of snow by tomorrow morning. Roads will be impassable." "I'm stocked up," I said. "It'll be fine." Miller narrowed his eyes. "You sure about that? This isn't a ski resort. When the power goes, it goes. And up here," he trailed off, glancing at the tree line. "I have a generator," I said. "Generator's good," Miller muttered. He took a half step back, as if he wanted to leave. "Hey," I said, stepping onto the porch. The cold air bit at my face. Did you know my grandfather well?" Miller hesitated. "Knew him. Everyone knew Silas, kept to himself mostly." "Did he ever mention the basement?" At the word basement, Miller flinched. It was subtle, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker in the eyes, but I saw it. He took a full step back now, moving down the first stair. "I don't know anything about a basement," he said quickly. Too quickly. "Come inside for coffee." I offered, desperate for human company, for someone else to witness the scratching, the thumping. Maybe if he heard it, he could tell me what it was. Maybe we could check it together. Rule number 5, never go alone. With Miller, I wouldn't be alone. Miller looked at the open door. He looked at the warm fire crackling inside. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw genuine fear in the eyes of this mountain of a man. "No," he said. "I've got rounds to finish. You stay safe, Elias. Keep that fire burning." He turned and walked away, his pace brisk, almost marching. "Wait," I called out. "What about the rules?" He left me a list of rules. Miller stopped near his truck. He didn't turn around. He just shouted back over his shoulder, his voice carried away by the picking up wind. "Follow them." He got in his truck and drove off, gravel spraying from his tires. He drove fast, like he was escaping something. I stood on the porch, watching his taillights disappear around the bend. I felt a sudden, crushing weight of isolation. The one person who could have helped me, who clearly knew something, had refused to even cross the threshold. He was afraid, not of the storm, not of the cold. He was afraid of the house. I went back inside and locked the door. The silence rushed back in to fill the space Miller had left, and from the basement, faint but audible, came a sound that sounded terrifyingly like a chuckle. By 2 p.m., the sky had turned the color of a bruised plum. The light was failing fast, sucked away by the gathering storm clouds that rolled over the peaks, like an avalanche in slow motion. The first flakes began to fall huge, wet clumps that stuck to the windows and piled up on the porch rail. Within an hour, the world outside was gone. There was no forest, no road, no mountain, just a swirling vortex of white that erased everything beyond the glass. The temperature plummeted. I could feel the cold seeping through the logs, radiating from the floorboards. I piled wood into the fireplace until the flames roared up the chimney. But the heat seemed to die 3 feet from the hearth, and then the power flickered. The overhead bulbs buzzed, dimmed to a sickly orange, and then surged back to brightness. I held my breath. Rule number 4. If the generator fails, fix it immediately. The lights are your shield. The generator was chugging away in the shed out back, audible even over the rising wind. As long as it had fuel, I was safe. But the flickering was a bad sign. It meant the load was fluctuating, or the wiring was old, or something was interfering with the current. I paced the main room. The cabin felt smaller now. The walls seemed to be leaning in. Every creak of the timber sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a scream. And the basement had woken up. The thumping had returned. But it wasn't rhythmic anymore. It was erratic, violent. Thump thump, crash thump. It sounded like someone throwing their body against the walls down there, thrashing in a confined space. I grabbed the shotgun ID found in the gun rack, an old 12-gauge pump action, and loaded it with trembling hands. I sat in the armchair, facing the black door, the weapon across my lap. "Shut up," I yelled at the floor. "Shut up down there." The thrashing stopped instantly. Then a new sound began. It wasn't a thump. It wasn't a scratch. It was a voice. It was muffled, coming through the floorboards and the heavy timber of the door. But I could hear the cadence. It was high-pitched, warbling, distorted. Elias. I froze. Elias. It was saying my name. It didn't sound human. It sounded like a parrot trying to mimic human speech, getting the syllables right. But the tone all wrong. It was metallic, scraping, devoid of breath. "Open the door, Elias." I stood up, backing away until my legs hit the stone hearth. "Who are you?" I screamed. "Who is down there, Grandpa?" The voice warbled. "I'm hurt. Elias, help me." My stomach dropped. It sounded like him. It sounded exactly like him, the gruff, gravelly baritone I remembered from my childhood. But it was wrong. It was skipping, like a scratched record. "Help me, cold, so cold." "You're dead," I whispered. "I saw them bury you." "Not dead," the voice insisted, shifting pitch, becoming a whine. "Trapped," he trapped me. The lights flickered again. Longer this time, 3 seconds of darkness before they buzzed back on. In those 3 seconds of dark, the voice changed. It dropped an octave, becoming a guttural growl that vibrated the floorboards beneath my feet. "Open it." Then the lights came back, and the voice was gone. Outside, the wind shrieked, slamming a branch against the roof. The storm had fully arrived. The road was buried. The ranger was gone. I was trapped in a box of wood and stone with something that knew my name. Something that could sound like my dead grandfather, and something that wanted out. And the generator sputtered. I heard the engine miss a beat. Chug, chug, silence. Chug. It was failing. The fire was the only thing that felt real. I fed it logs with the desperation of a man feeding a dying god, praying that the light and heat would be enough to keep the madness at bay. The generator had steadied itself for now, but the rhythm was off. It sounded labored, like a runner gasping for breath at the end of a marathon. I knew I would have to go out there eventually to check it. But the thought of stepping into the blinding white void, leaving the relative safety of the fire, paralyzed me. I stayed in the chair. The shotgun lay across my knees, heavy and cold. The voice from the basement had stopped. But the silence that replaced it was worse. It was a listening silence. I felt like I was being observed from below, as if the floorboards were made of one-way glass. I must have dozed off. It wasn't a deep sleep, just a momentary lapse in vigilance where my chin dropped to my chest. I woke to the sound of weeping. It was soft, pitiful sobbing coming from the air vent near the base of the wall, the only direct conduit between the main room and the basement. I sat up, gripping the gun. The sobbing hitched, sniffled. Elias? It wasn't my grandfather's voice this time. It was mine. It was my voice. Not a recording, but a perfect replication of how I sounded right now, scared, trembling, on the verge of panic. Elias, please, my voice whispered from the vent. It's dark down here. I don't like the dark. Let me out. My skin crawled. It felt like ants were moving beneath my dermis. I stood up and walked toward the vent, compelled by a mixture of horror and disbelief. Stop it, I hissed. Stop it, the voice echoed instantly, mocking me. Stop it. Stop it, stop it. Then it laughed. It was my laugh, but twisted, cruel. You're going to die here, Elias, my voice said from the basement. Just like the others, just like Silas. Silas died of a heart attack, I said, my voice shaking. Did he? The mimic asked. Did he really? Or did he just get tired of listening? Tired of the scratching? Tired of the rules? A loud bang from beneath the floor made me jump back. He came down here, the voice whispered, dropping the mimicry of me and shifting into something raspy and ancient. He broke the rule. He came down alone. He thought he could bargain. He thought he could make a deal. What are you? I demanded. I am the guest, the voice purred. I am the root. I am the thing your grandfather built this house to keep warm. The lights flickered again, violently this time. Buzz clicked buzz. The lights are dying, Elias, the thing taunted. The shield is breaking. And when the dark comes, the lock won't matter. The iron won't matter. You'll fix it, I said, backing away. Will you? The voice shifted again. It sounded like a child now. A little girl, it's so cold outside. You'll freeze. Stay inside. Stay with us. Just open the door. No, I shouted. Open the door. The voice screamed. A cacophony of 100 different voices layering over each other, men, women, children, animals all shrieking in unison. I scrambled back to the fireplace, my hands covering my ears. The screaming went on for 10 seconds, shaking the dust from the rafters, vibrating the plates in the cupboard, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it cut off. The silence returned, but the air in the room had changed. It felt charged, electric, heavy. The smell of ozone, like the air right after a lightning strike, filled the cabin, overpowering the wood smoke. I looked at the black door. The paint around the handle was blistering, bubbling as if the metal underneath was red hot. The entity wasn't just talking anymore. It was pushing. It was testing the boundaries of its cage, and I realized then that the rules weren't just about survival. They were about containment, and I was failing. I couldn't just sit there and wait to die. The passive terror was eating me alive. I needed to understand. I needed to know what I was fighting. I moved to the study alcove, a small nook filled with bookshelves and a heavy roll-top desk. I yanked the drawers open, searching for anything, a diary, a ledger, a note. Most of the drawers were filled with mundane paperwork, receipts for lumber, tax documents, old hunting licenses. But in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a false bottom made of plywood, I found it. It was a thick leather-bound logbook. The cover was worn smooth, stained with grease, and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. I opened it. The pages were filled with my grandfather's handwriting. Dating back 40 years, the 14th of October 1982, construction complete. The foundation is set, the iron is in place. The natives were right about this spot. The earth here is thin. I flipped forward. The 2nd of November, 1985. It woke up again last night. The scratching kept me up until dawn. I reinforced the door with oak. It chewed through the pine in an hour. It mimics the sounds of prey. Heard a wounded deer crying from the basement. Almost opened it. The 19th of July, 1990. I figured it out. It's not a monster. Not flesh and blood. It's a receiver. That's the only word for it. It amplifies. It takes your thoughts, your fears, your memories, and it bounces them back at you, distorted. It feeds on the frequency of panic. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. The 12th of December, 1999. It needs a mind. That's why rule number 5 exists. Never go to the basement alone. It's not because 2 people can fight it. It's because 2 people split its focus. It can't latch onto a single consciousness if Therese interference. Alone you are a singular signal. It can tune into you. It can drive you into the dark. If you go down there alone, you become part of the broadcast. I stopped reading, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead, a receiver, a psychic parasite. I flipped to the last entry, dated just 2 weeks before his death. The handwriting was shaky, erratic. The locks are failing, not the iron but the binding. I'm too old. My mind is weak. It's getting in. I hear it in my dreams. It wears my face. It tells me to come downstairs. I have to pass the burden. I have to give it a new warden, Elias. I'm sorry. You have the mind for it. You're stubborn. You're solitary. You can hold the line. But warn him. Warn him about the power. If the generator dies, the M field drops. The iron loses its charge, and then the door is just wood. I dropped the book, the generator, the M field. It wasn't just about light. The shield my grandfather mentioned, in rule number 4, wasn't a metaphor. He had wired the cabin, maybe the door frame itself, to create an electromagnetic field. That's what kept the thing contained. That's why the generator was critical. As if on cue, the lights buzzed loudly. The hum of the generator outside faltered. It coughed once, twice, and then, silence. The lights died. The cabin plunged into absolute darkness, save for the dying embers in the fireplace. The electronic hum that I hadn't even realized. Was there a subtle, high-pitched whine vanished. The air pressure in the room dropped instantly. From the basement, a sound of triumph erupted. Not a scream, not a laugh. The sound of the deadbolt sliding back. Click, the lock inside had turned. The only thing holding the door now was the padlock hasp on the outside and the physical weight of the door itself. I scrambled for the flashlight I had left on the table. The beam cut through the darkness, shaking wildly. The black door was vibrating. The wood was groaning. I had to get the power back on. I had to restart the generator, but the generator was outside in the storm. And the breaker panel. I remembered the layout of the cabin from my childhood. The breaker panel wasn't outside. It wasn't in the kitchen. It was in the basement to restart the loop, to re-engage the field. I had to flip the main breaker. I had to go down there, and I was alone. I stood in the center of the room, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The silence of the power outage was deafening. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of the bulbs, the distant chug of the generator all gone. The only sounds were the wind howling outside, and the scratching on the inside of the basement door. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was faster now. Eager, I ran to the window. The world outside was a swirling chaos of white. The snow was piled 3 feet high against the glass. Even if I wanted to run, I wouldn't make it 50 yards before the cold or the disorientation killed me. The truck was buried. The road was gone. I was trapped. Think, I whispered, my breath visible in the rapidly cooling air. Think, Elias, to get the power back. I needed to restart the generator outside. But even if I got the engine running, I had to reset the main breaker. To re-engage the electromagnetic loop my grandfather had built. If the breaker had tripped when the generator died, which was almost certain given the surge, I saw the power wouldn't flow until I flipped it back. The breaker box was at the bottom of the stairs on the far wall. I looked at the black door. Rule number 5, never go to the basement alone. I grabbed a shotgun. It felt useless against a psychic parasite. But the weight of the steel was comforting. I grabbed a heavy iron keyring. "Okay," I said to the empty room. "Okay, you want a signal. You want a mind. You've got one." I walked to the door. The scratching stopped as I approached. The entity knew. It could sense me. I slid the key into the heavy padlock hasp on the outside. My fingers were numb, fumbling with the cold metal. Click. The padlock popped open. I pulled it free and set it on the floor. Now, only the door latch held it shut. I took a deep breath, inhaling the stale, freezing air. I reached out and turned the knob. It was unlocked. The thing inside had already undone the deadbolt from the other side. I pulled. The door was heavy. Solid oak, but it swung open on well-oiled hinges. A blast of air hit me. It wasn't the cold, damp air of a root cellar. It was warm, humid. It smelled of ozone, wet copper, and something sweet like rotting flowers. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs was absolute. My flashlight beam cut into it, but the light seemed to be swallowed up after a few feet. I couldn't see the bottom, just wooden steps descending into a black void. "I'm coming down," I yelled, my voice shaking. "I'm flipping the breaker, and I'm coming back up. You touch me, I swear to God he'll burn this house down with both of us in it." Silence from the dark then, a whisper, close. Right in my ear, though no one was there. Promise, it was my grandfather's voice. I stepped onto the first stair. The wood creaked. I was breaking the rule. I was alone, and I was descending into the throat of the thing that had eaten my grandfather's sanity. Before I took another step, I retreated to the kitchen for one final preparation. If I was going down there, I wasn't going down with just a flashlight and a prayer. I grabbed the lantern, a heavy-duty camping model that put out 1,000 lumens, and hooked it to my belt. I checked the shotgun again, racking a shell into the chamber. The sound was satisfyingly loud, a mechanical clack-clack that momentarily disrupted the oppressive silence. But my real weapon wasn't the gun. It was distraction. I grabbed the portable radio from the shelf. It was a battery-operated emergency unit. I turned it on. Static hissed. I cranked the volume to the max. "White noise," I muttered. "Interference." If this thing fed on focused thoughts on a singular signal, then maybe, just maybe, a wall of chaotic static would act as a jammer. It was a desperate theory born from a single line in a dead man's journal, but it was all I had. I walked back to the open door. The warm metallic air wafted up again, making me gag. It tasted like licking a 9-volt battery. I stood at the precipice. The stairs were steep, narrow, and wooden. There was no handrail. Just rough-hewn stone walls on either side. "Okay," I said. "Let's do this." I stepped down. 1 step, 2 steps. The static from the radio filled the stairwell, echoing off the stone. Shh. With every step, the temperature rose. By the 5th step, I was sweating inside my parka. By the 10th, I had to unzip it. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I kept my eyes on the beam of the flashlight, refusing to look at the periphery, but I could feel it. The shadows weren't empty. They were writhing. I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a flash of flannel, a glimpse of a face. My grandfather standing just out of the light. "Turn back, Elias," the hallucination whispered, cutting through the static. "It's hungry." I didn't turn. I kept moving. "You're not real," I said through gritted teeth. "You're a broadcast. You're a frequency." Another step. Now I saw something else. A woman. My mother, who had died when I was 6. She was standing on the stairs below me, her back to me, weeping. "Don't look at her," I told myself. "Focus on the breaker. Focus on the mission." The mimicry was getting stronger. The entity was digging into my cortex, pulling out the things that hurt the most. I reached the bottom landing. The floor here was dirt, packed hard. The room opened up into a cavernous space, far larger than the footprint of the cabin above should allow. In the center of the room, illuminated by my shaking light, was a chair. A simple wooden chair. And sitting in it was me, a perfect copy of me, wearing the same clothes, holding the same shotgun. The other Elias looked up. His eyes were black holes. No iris, no sclera. Just void. He smiled. You broke the rule, the copy said. I raised the shotgun. Where is the breaker panel? I shouted over the radio static. The copy pointed a finger to the far wall, past the darkness. It doesn't matter, Elias. You're already part of the signal now. I ignored him. I ran. I sprinted past the doppelganger, feeling a wave of icy cold radiating from it as I passed. I hit the far wall and scanned frantically with the light. There, the gray metal box. I ripped the cover open. The main switch was tripped to off. I reached out my hand. Behind me, the static on the radio died. Not faded, died silence. Then, a breath on the back of my neck. Alone, a voice whispered. I slammed my hand against the breaker. The moment my palm hit the breaker switch, two things happened simultaneously. First, a spark of blue electricity arced from the metal box, biting my hand like a snake. I yelled in pain, but forced the lever up into the on position. Second, the darkness behind me screamed. It wasn't a vocal scream. It was a psychic shriek that tore through my mind like a serrated knife. It was the sound of 1,000 radio stations playing at once static, voices, music, crying. Laughter all compressed into a single, agonizing frequency. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, the shotgun clattering to the dirt floor. Get out! The voices roared in my skull. Get out of my head! The flashlight rolled away, its beam spinning across the basement walls. In the strobe light flashes, I saw the truth of the room. The walls weren't just stone. They were lined with copper wire, miles of it, coiled in intricate, geometric patterns that looked less like electrical wiring and more like a cage. And trapped within the coils were faces, shadowy, translucent faces pressing against the copper as if it were glass. I saw my grandfather. I saw the faces of strangers men in old-fashioned suits, women in pioneer dresses, the buyers my grandfather had mentioned, the ones who had disappeared. They weren't gone. They were here. They were stored. Elias. I looked up. The doppelganger, the thing wearing my face, was standing over me. Its black eyes were weeping a thick, dark fluid. Join us, it said. Its voice a harmonious chord of every victim in the room. It's lonely up there. It's warm down here. We are together. It reached down. Its hand wasn't flesh. It was shifting, unstable static, like a television tuned to a dead channel. I scrambled back, kicking at the dirt. My hand found the shotgun. Not today, I grit out. I didn't aim at the doppelganger. You can't shoot a hallucination. You can't shoot a signal. I aimed at the coils on the wall, the cage. If the electromagnetic field was what kept it contained, maybe it was also what gave it form. Maybe the copper was the antenna. I pulled the trigger. Boom. The shotgun blast in the confined space was deafening. The buckshot tore into the wall of copper wire, shredding the intricate patterns. Sparks showered down like rain. The screaming in my head intensified, turning into a high-pitched whine. The doppelganger flickered. Its form destabilized, turning into a jagged, glitching mess of pixels and shadow. No, it shrieked. You break the vessel. In breaking the radio, I yelled. I racked the slide. Clack, clack. I fired again. Boom. More wire shredded. The air in the room grew instantly colder. The humidity vanished. The smell of ozone turned to the smell of burning plastic. The doppelganger dissolved into mist. The faces in the walls faded, retreating back into the stone. But the darkness itself seemed to contract. It coalesced into a dense, black sphere in the center of the room, pulsating like a dying heart. I grabbed the flashlight and scrambled for the stairs. The radio on my belt suddenly crackled to life, but it wasn't static. It was a clear, calm voice. Warning, it said. Containment breach, signal lost. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I ran for the stairs, my lungs burning, the taste of blood in my mouth. As I hit the first step, the generator outside finally kicked over. The lights in the basement slammed on, and I saw what was really in the center of the room. It wasn't a sphere. It was a hole. A perfectly round, impossible hole in the dirt floor, leading down into an abyss that defied geology, and climbing out of it was a hand. A gray, elongated hand with too many fingers. I didn't look back. I ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, the sound of wet, slapping footsteps close behind me. I hit the top of the stairs and threw myself through the doorway, crashing onto the hardwood floor of the living room. I spun around on my back, kicking the heavy oak door shut with both feet. Slam. I scrambled to my knees and threw the deadbolt. Click. Then the iron latch at the bottom. Clang. I backed away, panting, the shotgun raised. The door shuddered. Boom. Something massive hit it from the other side. The wood groaned, but the iron held. Boom. Dust rained down from the frame. "You can't keep it out," a voice screamed from the other side. It wasn't the mimic anymore. It was raw, guttural rage. "The wire is broken. The cage is open." I looked at the lights overhead. They were burning bright, steady. The generator was running. The Field DM shield was active again. "It holds," I whispered. Grandpa built it to hold. I grabbed the heavy padlock I had left on the floor and jammed it into the hasp. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped it once, twice. Boom. A crack appeared in the center panel of the door. A sliver of blackness seeped through. Like smoke, I snatched up the padlock, shoved the shackle through, and snapped it shut. "Done." I yelled. "It's done." The pounding stopped. The smoke dissipated. The silence returned. I stayed there on the floor for hours. The shotgun trained on the door, watching the crack in the wood outside. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin was quiet. Around dawn, the wind died down. The sun began to bleed through the frosted windows, painting the room in soft hues of pink and gold. I stood up, my body aching as if I had been beaten. I walked to the door. The crack was still there, but when I put my hand near it, I didn't feel the warm, humid air of the basement. I felt cold. Just cold, damp air. The thing had retreated. Or was waiting. I walked to the kitchen and looked at the list of rules still sitting on the table. Rule number 5, never go to the basement alone. I picked up a pen. My hand was steady now, the steadiness of shock. I crossed out rule number 5. Beneath it, I wrote a new rule. Rule number 6, never break the copper wire. I understood now. My grandfather hadn't just been a warden. He had been an engineer. The basement wasn't just a prison. It was a machine built to suppress a natural frequency in the earth, a thin spot where something else could bleed through. By shooting the walls, I had weakened the cage. I had bought myself time, disrupted the signal long enough to escape, but I had damaged the integrity of the cell. The thing down there wasn't gone. It was just quieter, for now. I packed my bag. I didn't bother cleaning up. I left the shotgun on the table. I left the radio. I walked out the front door into the blinding white snow. The air was crisp, clean. The storm had passed. I trudged to my truck, which was buried up to the windows. It took me 2 hours to dig it out, as I drove away, navigating the treacherous, snow-packed road down the mountain. I looked in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent against the cliff. A plume of smoke rose from the chimney, and in the attic window, the small circular window I hadn't paid attention to before I saw a face. It was my grandfather. He was watching me leave, and he was smiling, because he knew. He knew I hadn't escaped. I had just started my shift. I didn't sell the cabin. I couldn't. Mr. Henderson looked surprised when I walked into his office a week later. I looked like hell unshaven, bags under my eyes. 10 pounds lighter. I dropped the heavy iron keyring onto his mahogany desk. The metal clattered loudly in the quiet office. "You're returning the keys?" Henderson asked, arching an eyebrow. "Most heirs wait a month before giving up. The isolation gets to them." "I'm not giving up," I said, my voice rasping. "I'm keeping it." Henderson paused. He looked at the keys, then at me. "You went inside. You stayed the night." "I stayed 3 nights." "And the envelope. Read it." Followed it. Henderson leaned back in his chair. For the first time, he looked impressed, or maybe afraid. "Then why are you here?" "I need to set up a trust," I said, like my grandfather did. "I need to make sure the property taxes are paid. I need to make sure the fuel delivery for the generator happens automatically every month. No missed deliveries, no matter the weather. We can arrange that." Henderson said slowly. But Elias, why, it's just a cabin. It's not a cabin, I said. It's a lid. I stood up and walked to the window. The city below was bustling, cars honking, people walking, phones ringing, all that noise, all that signal. They didn't know. They didn't know that 300 miles north, deep in the Bighorn Mountains, there was a hole in the world. A hole that whispered, a hole that remembered, I'm going back up in the spring, I said. I need to bring copper wire, a lot of it. Copper wire repairs, I said. And Henderson. Yes, if something happens to me, if I disappear. Or if you stop hearing from me, yes, burn the deed, I said. Don't look for a next of kin, don't find a cousin. Burn the deed. Bulldoze the road. And pray the generator doesn't run out of gas. I walked out of the office and into the busy street. I could still hear it sometimes, in the quiet moments between traffic lights. In the silence of my apartment at 3 a.m., thump, thump, it wasn't over. The thing in the basement had tasted my mind. It had my frequency now, and somewhere, deep in the dark, beneath the earth, it was dialing in. So, if you're ever hiking in the Bighorns, and you see a cabin tucked against a granite cliff, turn around, don't knock on the door, don't look in the windows, and for God's sake, don't listen to the static on your radio. Because if you listen closely enough, you might hear your own voice calling you home.